Well, well, well. I haven't seen you guys in a long time. I'm not seeing you now, or vice versa. Anyway, today we're going to talk about nomadic empires and Eurasian integration. They've been furiously editing and re-recording the last units to scale them down in size. So we're getting a truncated version of this and what's left. So this is mainly about the Mongol empires, which you can see there. The Mongol Empire turns into four empires eventually, but there are some other items of business as well. So let's start with a quote, shall we? Bentley and Ziegler are two favorite historians. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, nomadic peoples became more prominent than ever before in Eurasian affairs. Eurasia being a combination, of course, of the continents of Europe and Asia. How about that? Eurasia. Historians oftentimes sort of combine them and talk to them together, especially on subjects like today's. By the early 14th century, the Mongols had built the largest empire the world had ever seen. The military campaigns of nomadic peoples were sometimes exceedingly destructive, particularly the Mongols. Nomadic warriors often demolished cities, slaughtered urban populations, and ravaged surrounding agricultural lands. Yet those same forces also encouraged systematic and peaceful interaction between peoples of different societies. By fostering cross-cultural communication and exchange on an unprecedented scale, the nomadic empires integrated the lives of peoples and the experiences of societies throughout much of the Eastern Hemisphere. So we should already know that Professors Bentley and Ziegler, in their book, our book, Traditions and Encounters, love cross-cultural exchange. That's kind of like their main theme of the book. And it's certainly true that the Mongols, probably more than anybody else we've studied and will study in our last moments here, their whole empire was structured not intentionally, but to do exactly that. In many ways, the Mongols are sort of like the key middlemen in exchange of ideas and goods and diseases from Europe to China and back again. So partly because of their geographic place kind of in the middle, also because of their the importance of the horse to their societies and cultures, which at the time was the way to get from here to there in the quickest most efficient way possible. So they could take ideas and did, and sometimes at gunpoint or sword point to other far-reaching parts of Eurasia. So the Mongol Empire, they didn't set out to be the conduit of ideas and goods and services, from one end of Eurasia to the other, but as one of the unintended consequences of history, that's one of the most significant things that was accomplished, even though they didn't want to, or they didn't mean to. Turkish migrations and expansion. So the Turks are another, at least the early Turks, are another nomadic people. The horse, very important here as well, on the steppes also of Central Asia. So we look first at nomadic society on the Asian steppes. The climate of the steppes, steppes sort of means large plains overall, not completely flat land, but large expanses of grassland. Perfect for herding animals such as horses, sheep, cattle, camels, goats, and on and on and on, which is exactly what such nomadic peoples did for a living. They were pastoralists. We've talked about a few pastoral groups already, but only a bit here and there. We've looked at hunter-gatherers early in the class, and then farmers since. Pastoralists are kind of a third option. These are nomadic peoples who follow around or lead around their cattle, or whatever it is that they're herding. From the animals that they use, in this case the Turks, eventually the Mongols, they produce everything they can from the animals, clothing, shoes, tents, even alcohol, our textbook tells us. Not sure they pulled that off exactly, but they made alcohol from one of their animals. I'm not sure which one it was. Actually sounds kind of nasty, but anyway. They produced some pottery as well. The peoples on the Asian steppes, leather, iron weapons, and tools, but they engaged in vigorous trade with settled peoples. This is also true, of course, of what the group the Chinese called the barbarians, who were also a little bit further to the east, but still a nomadic people in much the same way, with many of the same cultural traits as the groups we're looking at here and now. Though we didn't focus too much on the barbarians, again, from the Chinese perspective. We focused on kind of how they were a nuisance to the Chinese. But here we're talking about very similar cultures and going into more detail. Their mobility because of the horse, their location, kind of in between Europe and East Asia, made them, as already noted, crucial trade links in Eurasia. Elites and commoners, our textbook tells us this, that the society was made up really of two classes, sort of elite noble types and commoners. Most decisions were generally made, at least early on in these groups' histories, at the tribal level, except for warfare. And the reason should be obvious. If you don't unite and have larger numbers of people fighting, relative to other peoples who have large numbers coming at you, you're probably going to lose. So, but this is the first step towards empire in nomadic, amongst nomadic peoples, because there's no empire if you have 50 people, 100 people, even 1,000 people traveling around together. You have to have far more than that. So we'll come back to that. Women were subordinated to men, but had much higher status than women in urban agricultural societies. So that is saying that yes, it's still a male-dominated society. It's still a misogynistic society, still a paternalistic society, however you'd like to phrase it. But nonetheless, women in nomadic groups, even outside of the Asian steppes, other nomadic groups around the world, some we haven't talked about, women tend to have higher status in those societies than in urban agricultural ones, like in China or Europe, etc. On the plains or on the steppes, women often were trained as skilled archers and horse riders. So that's one example of their higher status than in societies around the same time in other parts of the world. The nomads here held religious views and religious ceremonies revolving around shamans. Native Americans had similar religions as well. Something in the realm of what's known as animistic religion. The shaman is a medicine man, a priest, who is seen to have kind of supernatural special powers to understand, kind of predict the future, and kind of know what the gods or the spirits, want or demand of any group of human beings. Many of the peoples on the Asian steppes that are nomads eventually converted to other religions from sort of the animistic origins they came from, to Islam, to Christianity, to Buddhism, and other religions as well. One such group, the Seljuq Turks, who we'll meet momentarily, not only converted to Islam but moved to Iran. It wasn't very far away from the Central Asian steppes where they came from, and from there the Seljuk Turks spread Islam further, even outside of Persia, in multiple directions because of their tendency to conquer other peoples militarily. They were good at it, so they spread Islam by the sword. That's not to say that people that they conquered didn't sometimes want to convert because the religion was attractive to them. It was. We've already seen that in other places where Islam spread. Nonetheless, the Seljuk Turks were bringing it, with swords and military, conquests. Eventually, they organized the peoples of the steppes, huge confederations of tribes led by a Khan or a ruler. We're going to get to Chinggis Khan and some of the others. This is how they were able to form or carve out empires by conquest. In a sense, it's fusing lots of tribes together under kind of the leadership in a pyramid of power, ultimately under the leadership of the guy that becomes the Khan. So the tribes can still kind of peel off and go their own way under certain conditions, but they can also sort of be added like pieces again to kind of a pyramid type sort of block puzzle or something. So that the tribal elements, the tribal traditions of the culture still remain, but there's a lot of them now added together in a hierarchical fashion, and with one person, a ruler at the top. So some of the nomads in other parts of the world eventually conquer empires that are urban agricultural and sort of give up their nomadic origins, over time. But we don't see that as much here with these groups, the Turks, the Seljuq Turks, the Mongols, and eventually the Ottomans. Steppe nomads, no doubt about it, made formidable military adversaries due to mounted warfare, meaning on horseback, and its mobility and firepower. And so, because they were masters of riding horses and knowing how to deal with horses, it made them very difficult to fight against in ways that we'll see a little bit more of as we go along. The nomadic religions of Turkish peoples, we've already really talked about a little of this. So shamans worshipping multiple gods or multiple spirits. Eventually, many of them converted to other religions. I didn't say this before, they did develop a Turkish script, written language, partially, it seems, initially anyway, to record religious teachings. In the 10th century, due to the Abbasid Empire's influence, an already existing empire, Islamic empire, this rubbed off on the Turkish peoples, again, partly through their own conquests of such empires. So the Turkish empires as a whole, a number of the Abbasid Empire, the Sultanate of Delhi, which we'll get to. We won't talk about the Sultanate of Rum, and the Byzantine Empire, that's the Eastern Roman Empire, the one that remained after the Western Roman Empire fell, which is getting, through our period here, which is roughly consistent with the European Middle Ages, the Byzantine Empire is getting smaller and smaller and weaker, and it'll be killed off by one of our steppe nomad sort of warrior groups here toward the end of this time period, 1453 to be specific. So these empires certainly deserve a great deal of attention because they stand out as being unlikely to be able to do what they did. It's amazing, actually. So Bentley and Ziegler tell us that few armies were able to resist the mobility and discipline of well-organized nomadic warriors. When they found themselves at a disadvantage, they often were able to beat a hasty retreat and escape from their less speedy adversaries. With that military background, several groups of Turkish nomads began in the 10th century to seize the wealth of settled societies and build imperial states in the regions surrounding Central Asia. So, I don't want to mislead. We'll see that the various Turkish groups, the Mongols, the Ottomans, all coming from roughly the same steppe area, they conquer so many peoples that they do take over urban agricultural societies and empires themselves. Like China goes down to the Mongols, as we'll see. And they do rule then, urban areas and urban-based societies, but they're not very good at it because they sought to and often did maintain their nomadic culture and nomadic ways. So they were good at conquering such places, not as good at holding on to them. They were better at holding on to places they conquered that had a lifestyle like their own, values and cultures like their own, or closer to it. which makes, of course, sense. So the Seljuq Turks and Tughril Beg, sort of the first major, first leader amongst this group of steppe nomads of importance. The Turkish peoples as a whole, not all of them, but began to migrate closer and closer to the Persian Empire, eventually moving inside the Persian Empire. This is quite similar to what the Germanic barbarian tribes did to Rome. Before they took Rome down, they moved right next to it, and sometimes were allowed to live sort of within Roman borders. Why? Because the Romans had lots of stuff to trade for. And their standard of living was pretty high and way of life was pretty good, so it attracted lots of peoples that want to get in on the action. This is what brings the Seljuk Turks right to the doorstep of the Persian and Abbasid Empire. So they live sometimes outside, eventually inside. Some of the Turkish groups, the Seljuks included, served in the Abbasid Empires, the Islamic empire of the day, served in its military. By the 11th century, the Seljuks had gone so far as to not only kind of integrate, people, citizens into Abbasid, empire society, military and otherwise, but they'd gone so far as to have their leaders overshadow the Abbasid caliphs, meaning the emperor, the leader. And in 1055, the caliph, my words are sort of pushed together here, recognized good old Tughril Beg as a sultan. And Beg and his Seljuk Turk forces took control of Baghdad in the Middle East, it's now Iraq, and then his successors took by force, bloody force, Syria and Palestine as well. For the last 200 years of the Abbasid dynasty's existence, the caliph or caliph was a mere figurehead. The real power was in the hands of the Seljuk sultan. After a Seljuk Turk victory at a famous battle called Manzikert in 1071, the Seljuk Turks basically moved around, did what they wanted to at will within the Byzantine Empire. And so it was partially the Seljuk Turks that weakened and continued to weaken the Byzantine Empire. And it's a good sign, or it shows how weakened the Byzantine Empire was, that they were powerless to stop this sort of group from outside, foreigners in their minds coming in and sort of occupying and taking more of their land and doing whatever they wanted within the borders of the Byzantine Empire. But they couldn't stop it. They also, the Seljuk Turks couldn't take the empire out completely, mainly because Constantinople was for a long time an impregnable fortress. The city was surrounded by walls on most sides, one side by water. It was extremely difficult to get inside. So as long as the capital of Byzantium remained alive and well, there was at least some semblance of an empire. That eventually will change at the hands of another steppe nomad group from Eurasia. That'll be at the very end. Another group of Turks, led by Mahmud of Ghazni, the Ghaznavid Turks, named after their leader, established the Sultanate of Delhi, which means they went from their Central Asian homeland east instead of west and moved into northern India and carved out a fairly large empire, which you can see in the upper right of the screen here. So this group had come from roughly Afghanistan, which is sort of the kind of the Turkish sort of middle ground, and eventually got as far away as northern India. First to plunder and then to rule. So first they were just sort of raiding in order to take wealth and stuff, but eventually decided to stay and to try to control territory and people in what became an empire. The Punjab fell to the Ghaznavid Turks, then Gujarat and Bengal, which are big chunks of territory in what's now India. In the 13th century, they claimed authority as the Sultanate of Delhi, and basically claimed all of northern India as their own, or part of their own empire. The sultans of the sultanate, a sultanate has sultans, surprise, surprise, were intent on spreading Islam and regularly staged raids on Hindu and Buddhist temples in India and throughout the empire. Their shrines, monasteries, temples took their wealth, destroyed their buildings, slaughtered residents of cities. So it was a pretty brutal empire, particularly if you were of another religious belief outside of their own. So the Hindus and Buddhists really were persecuted and in danger during this period. And now we get to the mighty Mongol Empire. And this is an absolutely fascinating empire to study. In my opinion, it's the most interesting in all of world history, with the possible exception of the British Empire later in history. This one is incredible, partly because it's so improbable, or it appears improbable anyway, that this could have happened on such a vast scale. If you look at the rather crude map there on the right, that is at the height anyway of the Mongol conquests. That's how much land that they actually ruled over, which makes it the biggest empire, at least in terms of land, in world history, which it says on our screen. Paul Strathern, in a book called Empire, A New History of the World, really good book on a number of the empires we've either studied or are studying in this class, says no great empire is fundamentally unique, but the Mongol Empire would contain sufficient anomalies to set it apart from almost all other empires. This would be the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. Contiguous is just a fancy word for all sort of together. The British Empire was spread out all over the world. This one is sort of all together, and it's the biggest contiguous empire ever, stretching from the Pacific to the eastern borders of Germany, all the way across the Eurasian landmass. Yet it would prove the most short-lived great empire in history as well. So, those two things might be related. There's the possibility, which is always talked about in large empires like the Roman, we've already covered in this class, of what historians, scholars sometimes refer to as imperial overreach, or overstretch sometimes. Imperial overreach, meaning if you take too much land, more than you can actually administer, control, organize, it can backfire, and you might not be able to rule the land for very long or very well. Mongol military prowess. There's absolutely no doubt that the Mongols were a military force, or military group of military forces that were a danger to anyone who got in their way. Their military prowess was legendary then and has been ever since. This was a group that caused terror in enemies and potential enemies, anybody thinking about the Mongols sort of coming near them with their fearsome reputation, and they deserve the reputation. And the first great leader who united the Mongols sort of in that kind of system I mentioned before, were still tribal affiliations, but the tribes are now kind of all stuck together with one charismatic leader at the top, the Khan, and this becomes Chinggis Khan. And from the same book, Empire, Strathern says, or asks and then says, how did Chinggis Khan and his army of primitive horsemen achieve all of this, and with such speed? There was no doubting the efficiency and ferocity of his fighting men, organized in units of 10,000 men galloping behind their black horsehair banner. He knew, Chinggis Khan, the speed, endurance, and ruthlessness of his horsemen, and employed his lightning tactics accordingly. A typical move was for him to use heavy firepower to blast a passage to the enemy lines for his heavy cavalry units, and then fanning out behind their rear, cutting their supply lines and instilling panic, which caused the enemy to flee in all directions. Communication between separate units was maintained by the use of flags. Indeed, it is to the Mongols that we owe the art of semaphore. Many of you probably don't know what semaphore is. It's not used really anymore. You might have seen it in old movies. It was a system of communicating by raising and lowering and sort of moving flags in certain, rather kind of rote, repetitious motions, kind of like an alphabet through flags. Go up and down and sort of this direction and that direction, and sort of be seen by the next flag station over however many miles away, and they would relay from there. Semaphore code, it was sometimes called. It was the Mongols that invented this, but it came to went to Europe and other places beyond that eventually. The passage here talking about Genghis Khan's military leadership and the overall military ability of the Mongol groups, it's their militaries that made the whole empire happen in the first place. And the central institution of all the Mongol empires was the military. So it was military prowess through cavalry, right? Soldiers, archers, as you see in the lower right, mounted on horses, primarily that, and they did it extremely well. That explains their military victories. But the quote reminds me, this might sound like a stretch, but it reminds me of the German army in World War II and their blitzkrieg tactics. They didn't sort of go usually right through the center of enemy lines, but they go around them. And then after that, the goal was to get behind supply lines, cut them off, instill panic, and cause the enemy to be just totally discombobulated because they're so far behind the lines so quickly that with tanks, but they're doing it here with horses, that it just completely brings chaos and confusion to the enemy, and that's the goal. Genghis Khan also, as we'll see, I think in later slides, but I think it behooves us to sort of know this now as well. The system that was established required ultimate, complete obedience by everyone else to the leader. In this case, Genghis Khan himself, and from that type of system, then he was able to sort of organize, not just skilled horsemen, but horsemen who sort of fought efficiently and in ranks in kind of an organized, in a very organized fashion. Mongol political organization certainly was far less impressive than their military organization, but there are some features of it that are interesting to look at. Bentley says, because of his personal experience, Genghis Khan mistrusted the Mongols' tribal organization. He broke up the tribes and forced men of fighting age to join new military units with no tribal affiliations. He chose high military and political officials not on the basis of kinship or tribal status, but rather because of their talents or their loyalty to him, which to us sounds like a no-brainer. But things had been done for thousands of years in such societies based on it being passed down within the family, within the kin group. And he's now coming along and that's not going to work because when things are done through kin, through family, right, then we get the possibility that we have bad leaders. If one person that's descended from a former leader now inherits his father's position, but he doesn't have the ability of his father, then our kingdom, our group, our military effort, our war, it suffers for it. Our empire suffers for it. The most important institution of the Mongol state was, of course, the army, the military, and this magnified the power of a small population. It was probably only about 1 million or so people as a whole that carved out that entire empire that we've just looked at on a previous slide, at least on a map. Gigantic. So just the numbers are staggering. How do you do that with 1 million people? Well, partly you have anybody who can tote a weapon and ride a horse do so, but there are other aspects to it as well that we'll get into, some of which we'll get into. Barry Cunliffe, in a really interesting book called By Steppe, Desert, and Ocean, The Birth of Eurasia, fairly recent publication, says tribal allegiances had become weakened by long, drawn-out conflicts, and new power groups were emerging, confederations based on personal loyalties to those who could and would lead. Total obedience was expected at all levels in the chain of command. In such a system, charismatic leaders could acquire large followings and wield absolute power. I said that in my own words on the previous slide. It never hurts to reiterate something. Mongol trade and the significance of the Mongol Empire. This one is important in its own right, but it's the main way I think we can see Bentley and Ziegler's overall point and how they fit the Mongols into their pet theme, their favorite subject, cross-cultural exchange, in ways that I already talked about somewhat as well, but I'll read Bentley's own words here again. As a nomadic people dependent on commerce with settled agricultural societies, the Mongols worked to secure trade routes and ensure the safety of merchants passing through their territories. The Mongol Khans frequently fought amongst themselves, but they maintained reasonably good order within their realms and allowed merchants to travel unmolested through their empires. As a result, long-distance travel and trade became much less risky than in earlier times. Merchants increased their commercial investments, and the volume of long-distance trade across Central Asia dwarfed that of earlier eras. Lands as distant as China and Western Europe became directly linked for the first time because of the ability of individuals to travel across the entire Eurasian landmass. In a sense, again, unintentionally, and without being capitalists themselves, but in a sense what the Mongols did was create this gigantic free trade zone in Eurasia, and more or less allowed merchants from far and wide, this land and that distant land, to freely kind of to move back and forth through their empire, and beyond. Chinggis Khan, Temujin, a little more specifically, he said in a famous quote, this great leader in world history, certainly one of the greatest military leaders in all of world history. I'm from the barbaric north. I wear the same clothing and eat the same food as the cowherds and horse herders. We make the same sacrifice and share the same riches. I look upon the nation as a newborn child, and I care for my soldiers as if they were my sons. So this is actually something new. That's why the quote is, you see it often when the subject is Genghis Khan and the early conquests of the Mongol Empire. He is saying here that I used to just sort of see it, in our traditional cultural fashion, military campaigns, it is, as basically raiding, looting, and pillaging. But now I'm starting to sort of feel a responsibility to my own people, my own soldiers, and looking after their well-being. So the idea of a ruler, his job being to look after his people, believe it or not, that's something fairly recent in history, not just on the Eurasian steppes, but sort of all over the world, with a few standout exceptions. Strathern in the book Empire says prior to this, he, being Genghis Khan, had merely been interested in plunder, but now he'd ridden south and succeeded in something that no one else had ever achieved in history. He had defeated the Chinese, which is certainly saying something, to put it mildly. And from them, his army had learned how to use siege engines, catapults, even gunpowder. Genghis Khan now turned his eyes to the west and prepared to launch an attack upon kingdoms and empires with long histories and fabled cities, the like of which neither he nor his men had ever even dreamt existed. From now on, he vowed, he would unite the whole world in one empire. So, good old Genghis Khan, not the first and certainly not the last to have the dream of sort of uniting the world under his own leadership, or much of the world under his own leadership. So he was a pretty ambitious guy from this point forward. And so the Mongols started to fan out further and further, using their military advantages, their propensity to be able to dominate on the battlefield for multiple reasons in multiple ways, again and again and again. Conquests in one direction all the way into China, and we'll see take control of China, and all the way west to Persia, and a lot of places in between, eventually north to Russia. So this is the process of carving out this largest contiguous empire in world history. So our text talks about Genghis Khan, after having united the Mongols under his leadership, turns his army and attention to other parts of Central Asia. He attacked Turkish peoples ruling in Tibet, northern China, Persia, the Central Asian steppes, which basically means the first efforts to move at least in the direction of Russia. His conquests in Central Asia were important because they protected him against the possibility that other nomadic leaders might challenge his rule. But the Mongol campaigns in China and Persia had the most far-reaching consequences. So it's kind of the middle area that was the potential soft underbelly in between China and Persia. And by securing control of that area, or those areas, Genghis Khan rather shrewdly made it much less likely that he could be sort of taken down, made his empire much less vulnerable, at least during his own lifetime. While part of his army consolidated the Mongol hold on northern China, Genghis Khan led another force to Afghanistan and then to Persia beyond that, and won one victory after another. And you might not want to piss Genghis Khan off. There's a famous story that when he got to Persia, he was trying to handle things somewhat peacefully and sent out some negotiators, some diplomats, to come to some peaceful agreements about trade and other things with the Persian leader. And the Persian leader had his envoys murdered and killed. And so when Genghis Khan found out that his guys that had come under kind of a flag of truce and peace, you don't kill diplomats, you just don't do it. So he apparently wanted vengeance from there, and as Bentley and Ziegler say, he wreaked havoc and destruction on the conquered the land, meaning Persian soil and cities, ravaged one city after another, demolishing buildings and massacring hundreds of thousands of people. Hundreds of thousands of people. Some cities never recovered from this. So once again, I'll repeat, you might want to refrain from angering Genghis Khan. The era of the Four Khanates, this came about when Genghis Khan died in 1227. The quote on the right from one of our books, one of the ones we've been using here: the death of Genghis Khan in 1227 posed a potential crisis, but by following nomad tradition, which entailed leaving discrete blocks of territory to his sons, he propagated the empire, transplanting the Mongol system into distant parts of the world. So he divided the empire into four pieces and gave a chunk to descendants. And the most famous of the four Khanates, right? The word Khan means ruler. Khanates means sort of the ruler's territory. It's kind of a word for empire. But the most famous is the one you see red on the map, ruled by Kublai Khan, another famous Mongol leader and conqueror, and he established complete control for a time, or absolute control, I should say anyway, over China, and brought into existence the Yuan dynasty, which is somewhat misleading when you see the history of China and one dynasty after another, with the Ming dynasty and we've looked at the Qin dynasty and many others, the Song, the Han, but the Yuan was created by Kublai Khan, and quite effectively, at least the creation of it, not necessarily the long-term administration of it. So on the left, back to Paul Strather's book, Kublai Khan became the 5th great Khan of the Mongol Empire. So Genghis was sort of the first overall leader. This guy is the 5th. During his reign, the empire definitively split into 4 separate khanates. We already know that. Instead of attempting to reunite the empire, Kublai Khan turned his attentions south to China, moving his capital to what's now Beijing, with the intention of forming an entirely new empire there, which he basically did. The 3 khanates to the west would convert to Islam, while Kublai Khan's realm in China adopted Buddhism. So Kublai Khan, who became the Grand Khan, meaning, again, the overall leader of the whole thing, but this was probably wise in some ways, because it's such a vast, sprawling empire that it would be hard to administer the entire empire from one capital. So by dividing it into 4 separate empires, it's a little more governable in each one. That's not, I think, the only reason that it was done, but it's part of it, the reason. So the Great Khanate was one of the 4, and this was again the most important one in China. And the Yuan dynasty, calling it a dynasty with a Chinese name, was intentional and part of Kublai Khan's sort of overall, clever plan. He'd already proclaimed himself to be Emperor of United China in 1272, and as the first ruler of the Yuan dynasty. In choosing the name, which means the origin, he was playing to ideological beliefs deeply rooted in the Chinese psyche. He was also claiming the mandate of heaven, which all Chinese would understand. So he found a way to connect himself to the mandate of heaven, which we talked about earlier in Chinese history, but it's the idea that heaven, the universe essentially has chosen this or that leader to rule. Divine sanction, something similar to the European theory of divine right. God sanctions your rule. So he knew that the Chinese would understand this, and so he tried to connect himself, and he did so successfully. By connect, I mean, get people to accept in China that he is, does have the mandate. Though his territorial ambitions were not satisfied by the acquisition of China, the conquest marked the maximum extent of the Mongol Empire. China, united under its Mongol rulers after 300 years of division, enjoyed half a century or so of peace, during which its culture flourished. This is in the Yuan dynasty under the Mongols. Writers had a far greater freedom to express themselves than before, and landscape painters reached new heights of achievement. The traditions of North and South China were reunited, creating a reinvigorated excitement. Symbolic of this was the creation of a new Grand Canal, joining Beijing with Hangzhou in the south, and making the transport of surplus rice from the south both rapid and inexpensive. So, in some ways, it's kind of a golden age in China. China's had a number of golden ages. It's been around for so long, but it's somewhat surprising that an outsider group comes in, takes control, effectively the government wasn't that effective, but they took control and kept it for quite some time, so they were effective in that sense, and actually preside over a time of all kinds of achievements, cultural, technological, economic, etc. Cunliffe goes on, however, to say, that said, the Mongol system of government was heavy-handed and relied on a rigorous class system. So, though they appear to have been relatively open about, things like we'd call freedom of speech, freedom of the press today, they didn't have those terms and think of it quite that way in the modern sense, but they were open culturally, intellectually, but certainly not politically. This heavy-handed means that it was absolute, authoritarian, top-down power, and done, carried out brutally most of the time. The Golden Horde, another one of the Khanates you see on the right in the map there. That's a big chunk of territory, and that really overlaps overall with modern-day Russia. So this is the move into Russia by brothers and cousins of Kublai Khan, who moved on and took Russia between 1237 and 1241. Thereafter, they maintained a huge army on the Russian steppes, basically in the Ukraine, Crimea, Belarus, and a perfect place for them to kind of be. Barry Cunliffe saying, where their nomadic, I spelled wrong, their nomadic way of life and their social systems could continue uncorrupted. Indigenous tribes already shared a similar lifestyle. So here's one of those places I mentioned earlier that the Mongols were better ruling over after they conquered it. Why? Because they didn't have to. They weren't going into a place that was totally culturally and technologically different than what they were used to. The peoples that they ruled over in much of Russia lived a similar lifestyle because they lived on similar kind of steppe, wide open steppe land. And so they put their horses there, put an army there, a large one, but it was easier to rule because the indigenous people already had many of the same cultural traits. They never occupied Russia, interestingly, which wasn't true in most of their imperial conquests, but they did exact tribute. And this is partly because the Russians, for a long time, knew that if they didn't pay the tribute, which is a form of taxation, that they'd have the Mongol armies to deal with, and they didn't want that. But in time, Russia, starting with the princes of Moscow, the nobility, major nobility in and around the city of Moscow, started the process of uniting Russia, which required them to oust the Mongols, and by the mid-16th century, they'd more or less done so. By the mid-16th century, they'd pushed the Mongols out of the last part of Russia, which was basically the Ukraine, the sort of steppe areas. Although our text makes it clear that the Mongols held on in Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, the Black Sea, which is still part of Ukraine. It used to be part of Russia and the Soviet Union before that, but they held on to that until the late 18th century, which is quite amazing. So some remnants of Mongol power did live on for a long time, even though the larger empire, the Golden Horde and other parts of it, were relatively short-lived. Remember, it's the biggest contiguous empire in world history, but the shortest-lived one. Didn't last as long. Hulegu Khan, another one of the family, brother of Kublai Khan, carved out the Ilkhanate of Persia, and he pulled off one of the most famous and dramatic feat in all of the history of the Mongol Empire when he conquered the Abbasid Empire, and in 1256 annihilating the Nizaris, or the Assassins as they were known. This group of trained, a military force, but kind of a secret military force that actually carried out lots of assassinations. It's not the only thing they did, but they fought using kind of guerrilla tactics, a lot of sort of covert operations, and yet the Mongol armies under Hulegu just wiped them out. And 2 years after that, they took Baghdad. After a brief siege, Hulegu's army sacked the city, executed the caliph, executed him, the head of the whole empire, and massacred about 200,000 people in the process. So when the Mongols came after you to take you down, they didn't pull any punches. It was brutal stuff. The people in that part of the world, in the Middle East, many of them still remember. I don't mean, from personal experience, but they're still sort of taught about the horrors from the Middle Easterners' perspective of the period in the Middle Ages when the Mongols conquered them. but the Mongols conquered just about everybody. So, you're in good company if you get conquered by the Mongols. As Strathern says, the Mongols had no experience administering complex societies, where successful governance required talents beyond military prowess. They had a difficult time adjusting to their role as administrators. So they're great at conquering you. They weren't nearly as good at ruling over you and putting, organizing, administrating, carrying out policy, passing laws, at least effective ones. They weren't nearly as good at doing that. In Persia, in the Ilkhanate, they used the strategy of basically letting regional elites govern as long as they paid taxes. All the way back near the beginning of our class, when we saw the very first empire in Mesopotamia, we saw that Sargon the Great, was the first one that sort of had to make the choice between, okay, do I govern the empire by sending out my own governors and guys, because I can't be in all those places that far away from my capital, who carry out, laws and policy, that I send out, or do I co-opt already, leading figures indigenous to that area? You can do it either way, and there are positives and negatives on doing it either way. But the Mongols did it differently than Sargon had done before. So I'm not sure exactly why, but instead of putting out sending out their own governors from their own family or trusted, advisors, they co-opted elites from the conquered areas. As long as such people were loyal and paid their taxes, they gave them kind of privileged status and helped to prop them up. One of the advantages to doing it that way is that people are much more likely in that part of your empire to go along with your policies if they're being carried out by one of their own. They might even think that the policy is coming from him and not from the foreigner who rules them from outside, in this case the Mongols. The rulers eventually were influenced by Persian culture itself, especially and including religion, and the Mongols in the Ilkhanate of Persia eventually converted to Islam, as they did also in the Golden Horde and Chagatai, the one we're not going to talk about. Well, all empires that we know of eventually decline and fall and crash and burn like the Roman Empire did. So this happened to the Mongols as well. As usual, they had difficulty governing in China and everywhere else, especially after, again, they suffered the problem of imperial overreach, gigantic empire. In Persia, our textbook tells us, exorbitant spending, overexploitation of the peasantry, meaning they tax the people that are already poor, way too much to death, led to a sharp drop in revenue, factional struggle in government, all kinds of different sort of strongman warrior types, sort of jostling for position, which isn't good for stability, and a disastrous attempt at a paper currency, which failed. Nobody had confidence in the paper money in that part of the world. So it's a good example of the bumbling that the Mongols did in trying to govern empires. Again, great at conquering other peoples, great at the military part of the operation, not so good at the winning the peace after the war. In China, they used paper money again. This time, the Great Khanate. China had used paper money for a long time, so this was easier to do. But they did fail to back it up with bullion, gold, whatever other metallic, valued metal, kind of like a gold standard. And because of that, partly because of that, the public lost confidence in the currency, and prices shot up, and so there's economic problems in this part of the Mongol Empire as well. Factions within governments were a constant problem. Lots of ambitious warriors were attracted, particularly to the Great Khanate in China, because it was the wealthiest of the four. And these ambitious warriors would often worry more about taking on the rivals that were, Mongol leaders themselves than about other problems outside of the empire. So the Chinese population eventually rose up against the Mongols. They did it time and time again, eventually successfully. As Cunliffe says, the sudden rise of the Mongol Empire was, by any standards, a remarkable phenomenon. How was it that a steppe nomad tribe could, in the space of a mere 80 years, conquer the greater part of Eurasia? It is rather extraordinary that this group of kind of simple, horsemen and nomads from the steppes were able to take, sort of so much territory and people from different backgrounds and cultures, under their thumb, and doing so through incredible violence. But nonetheless, I'm not saying it's impressive morally, but it's certainly impressive in many other ways. Once the Mongols weakened and basically, crashed, there were power vacuums in all these khanates. A power vacuum means that there's sort of nobody in power. There's no government. There's, chaos reigning, anarchy. So a good example of what can happen in such situations is the life and career of one of the most, to me, incredible figures in all of world history, Timur, or Tamerlane, as he became known. This guy was a self-made conqueror, in a sense, sort of a mercenary who carved out his own empire. He did come from a Turkic/Mongol background, but not from. He wasn't a descendant of the big name Khans that we've just talked about. So this isn't actually technically part of the Mongol Empire. It's after it fell. But there's a power vacuum, and he's one of many in all four of the Khanates trying to say, okay, there's nobody in power. There's anarchy there now. I'm going to become the next ruler. He walked with a limp. I forget why. And he became known as Timur the Lame, hence the anglicization of the word Tamerlane. I bet many people not many people teased him for having a limp, however, at least not once he became a leader. Genghis Khan was his model, kind of his hero, as he sort of came to the fore, was a young sort of go-getter, ambitious. He also, like Genghis Khan before him, appears to have been charismatic with great personal courage, which helped to attract more and more loyal, dedicated followers willing to follow him to the ends of the earth and risk their lives into battle. He eliminated rivals like Genghis Khan had in tribe after tribe after making himself leader of his own tribe. By 1370, he'd conquered the Khanate of Chagatai, the one of the four that we didn't talk about. Built a splendid capital, imperial capital city at Samarkand, and spent from there the rest of his life on military conquests, one after another, most of which were successful. He got as far as Persia and Afghanistan, took down the Golden Horde in Russia, sacked Delhi in India, and was even planning an invasion of China himself when he died in 1405. So the whole thing was cut short. He didn't quite have the same system set up to pass it down through the family in the way that Genghis Khan had before him. But it's an incredible life and an incredible career. One might argue, and certainly scholars have, that it just did harm by spreading power or accruing power for power's own sake. But nonetheless, what he achieved was incredible because it was so unlikely, and in some ways, it's almost like he was this kind of freebooter, freelance, steppe nomad conqueror, and he had grand success like the Mongols before him. Lastly, we get to the rise, and we're going to do this in one slide. I'm not doing them justice. Rise of the Ottoman Empire. Its founder was Osman Bey, another Turk, who came from one Turkish tribe, but another ambitious, guy, ruthless enough to, wrestle power from neighboring tribes and force them under his thumb, eventually controlling a chunk of territory in Turkey itself and fanning out from there. Paul Strathern says the Ottoman Empire may be viewed as the last of the old-style empires. Initially, the world's great empires had been initiated by the urge to conquest. Indeed, in the case of the Mongol Empire, arguably this appears to have been the beginning and the end of the entire project, meaning conquest was all they thought of. After that, they didn't know exactly what to do. We've seen that that's somewhat true. Other more civilizing or more exploitative aspects came in the wake of conquest, meaning it doesn't appear to have been the goal, but nonetheless, since they're now kind of stuck with the territory they've fought so hard to acquire, they have to do something with it. He goes on to say that Osman's founding dream was not only the founding myth of Ottoman nationals, or national identity, but also played a leading role in the psychology of his descendant Mehmet II, who became famous in his own right, because despite being deposed, Mehmet II, much later on, centuries later, by the Janissaries, a textbook talks about the Janissaries, an elite military force in the Ottoman Empire, he was able to return, or had the guts to return to rule and got away with it. The Janissaries were the military force in the Ottoman Empire. And what this is telling us is that when Mehmet sort of acceded to the throne, that the Janissaries were against it and basically forced him out, deposed him, toppled him, toppled his rule. The military force, had the muscle to do that. But he actually manufactured a return and actually got eventually the Janissaries to support him loyally. And within 2 years of his comeback, he had laid siege to Constantinople, the great city of the Byzantine Empire, an impregnable fortress city, and he breached its walls partly with the use of artillery in the hands of his soldiers, officers, and his army took Constantinople in 1453, a famous date because it's a major turning point in world history, and the Ottoman Empire was really, really on the map. So from the Seljuq Turks to the Mongols to the Ottomans, we've seen that these steppe nomads from Eurasia were really good at carving out an empire or empires.